Right now we have Linda Betsinger McCann, and she is one of the most prolific authors, as you can see from all of her books here, in Iowa. She writes and reviews the history of Iowa, and right now she's going to do the Civilian Conservation Corp, the CCC of Iowa. Yep.
Well, thank you for coming out. Like some of you heard, I'm from Shell Rock, about 30 miles north of Waverly Shell Rock schools. I did not grow up there. So when we moved there, I took some time off because we had 2 little girls, and I also began doing my family genealogy. With a name like Betsinger, I never knew anybody that wasn't related to me. And so I got into that and such. Well, then when I went to my mother's family, I found out I was descended from the founder of Shell Rock. And like I said, I had not grown up there. My mother and my grandmother did not know this. So I was determined my kids, and now my grandkids, know this. About 15 years ago, a group of us started the Historical Society in Shell Rock. And I got elected president. And I'm still president. Yeah. Anyway, because I didn't grow up there, I don't know the history like others do. So I would stumble onto something, decide to research it, turn it out into a book, and the museum would make a little money off of it. So I've done 14 books that are just about Shell Rock history. Well, I was also the person that they came to bring stuff to donate to the museum. And they would come to my door and say, this is from Coster, this is from Butler Center. And I'm going, why are we taking this? So finally I said, why are we taking all this other stuff? And they said, oh, those are those little towns that aren't there anymore. Okay. So I finally decided I needed to find out something about them. So I drove out to Butler Center because that was the county seat for Butler County for 20 years. All that's there is a cemetery. And you know, this is what I found. I found nothing. So I did a book that we called Where Do They Go? And it was about 8 of these named locations around Shell Rock. So we put it out, just moved on, and I started getting emails from a place called History Press. And I didn't even open them because I hadn't contacted them, you know. Well, I'm downtown one day in Shell Rock, and a lady says to me, have you been getting messages from History Press? I said, yeah, I've been deleting them. She goes, no! She's a professor over at Creighton, and for whatever reason, Shell Rock's her summer home. I haven't figured that out yet. History Press had been on the Creighton campus, and so she gave them my information. Well, when the next message came, I did open it. We began talking. They wondered if I could take the book about the lost towns, turn it into a county-wide book, and we could have a series. And I kind of went, I think so? Well, we did, but we ran into a problem because they wanted to call these ghost towns. And I said, they're not ghost towns. They're hayfields and cornfields and cemeteries. So we went round and round, and finally I said something about them being lost to history, and that's where the lost came from. Well, we did Butler and Blackhawk, I did with History Press. And after Blackhawk came out, they came to me and said, this isn't a viable series, they were cutting me loose. Well, I'm still trying to figure out what they were looking for, because they only printed 1,000 books, and we had sold 700 in the first 6 months of Blackhawk County. Whatever. Anyway, I did do more research then, and the Iowan came to me. The Iowan magazine, the old magazine with all the good pictures, that's who my publisher is. And they pretty well let me do what I want. Once in a while I just get a little nuts somewhere, but otherwise I get to write what I want. So when I was doing Blackhawk County, I was looking for a town by the name of Aladdin, Iowa. Yeah, couldn't find it anywhere in Blackhawk County. And so I was at the Cedar Falls Historical Society, and I said, you know, I couldn't find this. And they said, well, have you looked at the trolley? I said, what trolley? Well, there was an electric train that ran between Waverly and Cedar Rapids. Ran for over 50 years. And again, I had never heard of it. So they went and got some information, and on the schedule, there's Aladdin. So it was a stop on this trolley. So then I began talking about the trolley when I would speak. And I was getting so many fantastic stories that I had to write about that. So that became the Cedar Valley Road. Well, when the Cedar Valley Road came out, I was up in Denver, north of Waterloo, and I was talking to a group of ladies who told me after Prohibition, each county decided if they were wet or dry. Black Hawk County, Waterloo, went dry, which still confuses me. Bremer County, Waverly was wet. So the ladies were telling me that their activity for Saturday night was to go to the depot and watch the men get off the trolley. The men would ride from Waterloo to Denver to get their supplies. And then the ladies said if their parents would let them stay late, it was even more fun after the guys had spent an hour in the tavern, you know. So we were having a good time, and they were telling me stuff I didn't know. And when we finished, their activity director came up to me, and she literally whispered in my ear, what was Prohibition? Well, I about fell over. She was in her mid-30s, I would guess, and I just, wow. So I explained it to her, and driving home, I'm thinking, wonder what my daughters know. So I called them. They're both Wartburg College graduates. They tell me I have to tell you they're not history majors. Because they knew Al Capone, they knew the Untouchables, they tried to put Bonnie and Clyde in with it, and my teenage granddaughter said, Prohibition of what? So that's how Prohibition came about. Well, when the Prohibition book came out, I was speaking to a newspaper reporter in Waverly. And the guy says, what's your next book? And I said, well, I'm thinking either the POW camps or the CCC camps. And again, his face is just blank. He went to Drake. I do ask him now. Finally, he says to me, were the POW camps from the Civil War? Oh. Yeah, again. And he had no clue what the CCC was. Well, Waverly had a POW camp. And so I told him about this, the little bit I knew, and he's never written about it. And I just think, okay. So when I got done, I was ready to go to the POW just like that. Well, then my publisher says, well, you know, you've been doing chronologically. You really should do CCC first. I said, okay. So we thought we'd have two books, the east and the west part of the state. Well, again, when I get into it, I find out what I don't know. And so the northeast book and the southeast book are out. I have finished the central part, and I am working in the western part now. So we'll have either 4 or 5 books on the CCC. Well, last Christmas, I just couldn't wait to do POWs anymore. So I started on my own. I did not tell my publisher, but she found out somehow. And she said, if you get it to me by August, we'll have it out in October. And so she has it, and it's supposed to be out within the next couple weeks. So, and like I just told some of you, I have just recently found out there's at least 16 women that were Rosie the Riveters still alive in Iowa. And so I'm trying to find more. I want to talk to them. I think we can have a book on that. So I always say I just very much stumble onto something and decide I need to write about it. So anyway, the CCC, Civilian Conservation Corp, this operated from 1933 to 1942. Why did we need it? Well, these were the Depression years. And especially when I talk to kids, they don't understand what that means. And so I really have to try to get through to them, but I know they still don't understand. I spoke to a 5th grade class this spring, and there was one little boy that all he kept saying was, why didn't they get a job? And I say, there are no jobs. Well, why didn't they go somewhere else and get a job? I said, first off, they don't have gas, and second, there are no jobs. And then he'd just start again, you know. Finally, I just quit talking to him. But I thought, I really felt sorry for his teacher, you know. But that's how it is. I do tell them about a guy that I talked to. This guy was down in southeast Iowa. And he was too young to join the CCC when it started. You had to be 17 to 23 to go in the beginning. He was too young, but he was already supporting his family. He had 2 younger brothers, his mom and his dad, and himself. He was diving for clamshells in the Mississippi River. He was getting paid a penny a shell. And he hoped to make 50 cents a day. And in my mind, I'm thinking, he can't even eat as many calories if he could, you know. And as we're talking, he says to me, I tried not to eat a lot so my brothers could eat, you know. So the minute he turned 17, he went into the CCC. And again, I said to him about how hard they worked. He said, I was working hard before. They gave me new clothes. They gave me new boots. I got a bed to myself for the first time. He said, I got all the food I could eat, plus I could see a doctor and a dentist. Why wouldn't I have joined, you know? And overall, this is how the guys feel. I've talked to 21 guys that were in the CCC, and they can tell me stuff I can't find in books or anywhere else, you know. So that's how bad it truly was everywhere. So FDR is elected in November of 32. He's inaugurated in March of 33. And within a week, he goes to Congress and spells out what he calls the Tree Army. And evidently, in Iowa, they say we had no forest in 1930. I mean, that's got to mean a certain amount of acreage, but still, to think about that, no large stand of timber in Iowa. And it must have been that way nationwide, because FDR had done this tree army in New York State while he was governor. So he spells out this tree army, goes to Congress, it's back on his desk within a week, ready to be signed. The first camp opened April 7th of 33. And by the end of April, we had 4 camps in Iowa. You know, wow. Now, we were very fortunate. When Spirit Lake, or Melford really, wanted to have a camp, there were some things that had to happen. The first thing was they had to have a sponsoring organization. And this is like Chamber of Commerce, Businessmen's Group, something on that order. This group's going to spend money to get a camp in town. And why I say that is they've got to have land leased for the camp. And it's got to have water, sewer, and electricity. And if it doesn't have that, they got to put it in. So to get a camp, they're going to have to spend money, probably. The second thing was they have to have a work project. Well, we have to back up to 1930. Anybody ever heard of the 25-year conservation plan? Okay, I hadn't either, and I kept running into it. Our governor in 1930 could see that we were headed for problems. And he actually put together a group of men to see what could be done. The soils wore out, we have no forest, we're losing half of our young men have left the state. What are we going to do? So they put together what came to be called the 25-year plan, conservation plan. It was called 25 years because they expected it to take 25 years to accomplish this. The CCC did 75% of it in 9 years. You know, wow. So this plan is very wide-reaching. It's from building sewer plants so we don't have sewage runoff in the waters. All teachers should have a 2-year teaching degree. Planting forest, revitalizing the soil. Then they go into, they want to have a state park within 40 miles of every island. In 1930, we had 4 state parks, but nothing had been done with them. There were no roads in them, there was nothing there. Nobody used them. All they had done was preserve the land, you know. So they had plans, this 25-year plan, had plans for 24 dams to be built, which would create 24 lakes and 24 state parks. The CCC built 18 of them. And, you know, it just really went into detail for each of these state parks. I'm going to tell you about Backbone over at Strawberry Point because that's what I'm most familiar with. But this was for every park was spelled out like this. It starts out that they're going to build the dam on the Maquoketa River. That will create the lake. Then they're going to build a beach house. They're going to build a bathhouse. Talks about Ranger's house, you know, all this sort of stuff. Says we need to build roads. We need to build trails. They built an amphitheater. They built the fish hatchery. All this is spelled out in the plans. Then it says they will need 5,000 men to work 7 years to accomplish this. And that's exactly what worked for the CCC. 5,000 guys worked on Backbone for 7 years to make it a park. And like I say, this plan spelled out every one of these parks like that. So when Melford or anywhere else wanted a camp, they just had to go to this plan. It's all spelled out there. And that's why we could get going so fast. Now the first 4 camps, Albia is called the first CCC camp in Iowa. That's in southwest Iowa. That was a soil erosion camp. Then Backbone at Strawberry Point, Ledges at Boone were state parks. And there was one up near Spencer here that was a soil erosion also. Now do you know about the soil erosion? Because again, I didn't know a thing about that. I knew the state parks. Well, when I got researching, I couldn't find out much about the soil erosion. There wasn't anything in books, there wasn't anything in magazines, newspapers, you know, nothing. So I send stuff to newspapers and ask them to print it. And usually I get some phone calls out of it. And so that's what I did. I got a phone call from Maquoketa over by Dubuque and Davenport. And the guy says, do you want to see a flume, F-L-U-M-E, built by the CCC? I didn't know what a flume was, but I said yes. He says, well, you can't tell anybody where it's at. Okay. And so he gives me an address where I'm to meet him. It's like 2 hours from me. So as I'm driving over there, I'm kind of going, this could be the stupidest thing you ever did. Well, I knew the museum manager at Maquoketa, and so I went to her and I said, do you want to go see a flume? And she said yes. So we went to the address, and she knew the guys, so okay. The guys put us in a pickup truck, and if you would ask me, I would have said we drove 20 miles off-road and never crossed another road. I know you can't do that in Iowa, but you know, we were up and down, and we were round and round, and then we're opening and closing gates because of cattle. You know, I mean, they took us somewhere we couldn't have found our way back to town, or I sure couldn't have. We get there, and this is what I see. And I'm going to pass these around so you can see them. We're in a valley, and all around us are hills, and on the hills are cornfields. Well, you can kind of see a little grassy area that comes down and comes right to the top of the flume. And so it's set up to drain the water off the cornfields and come right to the flume. The flume was 8 foot tall. And one of the guys that was there said to me, he said, we have had water this high. It has swamped this. And he said, just a couple years ago, we wouldn't have had any crops if it wasn't for this. He says it saved us year after year. Well, and of course it's got the CCC plaque on it. So, you know, we talk about it. The guy that had talked to me had been a kid when this was built. And one of the things he said to me was, the CCC guys scared him. And I kind of went, really? He said, well, this was early on when they didn't have a lot of showers. And he said they had beards, their hair was long, they didn't have shirts on. He said, they scared me, you know? So that was just interesting to me. So as we leave, they say, do not tell anybody where this is at, as if I could have. So, of course, you know what we talked about all the way back to town. And we didn't have a clue why we couldn't tell anybody. So I get home, I get a phone call from Cresco, which was a soil erosion camp. And the guy says, do you want some pictures of a dam built by the CCC? I said, can I come and see them? No. Okay, I'll take the pictures. This guy set up an email account, wouldn't tell me his name, and that's how we corresponded. So I asked him to wash the plaque and take another picture, and he did, you know. The pictures are in the book, and when I got to caption it, I said, how do I caption this? And he goes, near Cresco. Okay. Well, it's kind of interesting. When I spoke at Cresco, I kept watching him thinking, I wonder if he's here, you know? And nobody gave anything away that it was this guy. But the people that lived there were just studying that. Nobody knew where this dam was. They knew where others were, but they didn't know where that one was. Okay, so not too long after that, I went up to McGregor, because McGregor started as a soil erosion camp, and then they went to a park and they worked at Pikes Peak. When I went there to see a flood control project, I have a cousin that's a council person, and she could get me in because part of it's underground. And she said, you know, this saved us in 2008. We would not be here if it wasn't for this. She said, now it's on the National Register of Historic Places, and we'll probably never get to replace it, you know. So I spoke at the library that night, and a guy came in and gave me these. And I said, can I go see this? He goes, no. And you know, I'm going, what am I missing? I don't understand. So I spoke, and he left, and another guy said to me, you do know why he won't let you go see that, don't you? I said, no. He goes, it's on private property, and they're afraid of vandals. Okay, that kind of makes sense, you know. And that was really what the soil erosion was for. It was set up to help the individual farmers renew their land. I mean, they did terracing, they did the dams and the flumes, they did gullies down in southwest Iowa. I just can't believe, you know. People in southwest Iowa do about soil erosion, you know. Nowhere else have I run into anybody knowing about it. Down south of Des Moines, they did some sort of watershed that I can find it in the newspapers, but nobody there knows anything about it and can't tell me where to start looking for it. And this is what I find all over. The people, they're afraid. You know how people are. Oh, the government built it so I can go see it. You know, that sort of thing. And the farmers got a very good deal. All the labor was supplied. All they had to pay for was materials. And they figured that this worked out to be like a nickel an acre, a cost for them. But you can imagine in the beginning, they couldn't convince the farmers to do this. You know, Iowa State had been trying to get the farmers to do it, and they couldn't. Then Iowa State worked with the CCC, and they still couldn't get people to do it. And so in many cases, they set up a test plot and how you're farming, you know. Come see the difference, that sort of thing. By 35, there's a waiting list to get on the list to use this, you know. And the Soil Conservation Service came out of this, got started, and ran with everything. So that's the soil erosion, and this soil erosion work was 75% of the work projects in Iowa. All these parks we know about was only 25% of their work. The soil erosion was 75%. And we don't see it, you know. When I went to Marion, because Marion by Cedar Rapids was a soil erosion camp, and it was right downtown, and they worked around town. And all that is housing, new housing now. And I thought, I'll bet you all of that was just plain bulldozed. Nobody knew what it was. We don't need it. You know, it's completely gone. And who knows how much more is gone also, you know. So anyway, that was the soil erosion, and it was such a big project and we don't know anything about it. It just really continues to astonish me. So, that's what a town had to do. The guys had to be 17 to 23, unmarried, unemployed, living at home, and no one in their family could be working. This is all in the beginning. So, in April of 33, they do a call-up in each county, and this is based on population. Bremer County was 20, and sorry, I didn't look up what you were. It'll be in this book for this area. They figure 4 times that amount showed up to go in. They had to go to the relief office at the courthouse, and the person in charge chose who went. Now, I don't know how you guys are, but yeah, Bremer County, I'm going, yeah, you're my cousin's nephew, you're my son-in-law's brother, you're my, you know? Well, that got changed quickly, but for the first time, that's how they were chosen. They figure about 10% of them were sent home because they were ill. Tuberculosis was just rampant. So within a short time, they're all down at Fort Des Moines, and they spend 2 weeks at Fort Des Moines. They get uniforms, they get boots, they get foot lockers, they get to eat, they get shots, and they're out to work, just like that. And like I say, we had the 4 camps that they went to. Well, one day, one of the guys that I talked to said to me, they didn't want us in town. And I said, what? I thought they wanted you. Well, they wanted the camp. They didn't want us. And you know, because they had to have the water, food, and electricity, many of them ended up at fairgrounds, which are on the edge of town. So these guys work from 8 to 5. They go to supper, and they have to put on a dress uniform and a tie to get supper. And these guys that I talked to were still talking about this. They had to wear a tie to supper. They couldn't get supper if they didn't have their tie on. But by 6:30, they're done for the day. They're free to do whatever they want till 10 o'clock when they have bed check. Guess what they want to do? They want to go to town. So, because there was this confusion, they tried to think, what can we do to keep them busy? And one of the things they came up was playing ball, kitten ball, softball, eventually boxing. Boxing was a real big deal. And they actually would invite the town to come out and see the games, because they did learn that there were these tales in town. You have 200 young men that you don't know, you have 50 army guys you don't know, and you have about 20 foremen. So 270 strangers come into your town, yeah, you're a little cautious, you know. So they did begin holding open houses, trying to get the people to come out and see what was going on. Well, they offered lunch in a lot of cases. And of course, people weren't eating. So they went to the camp. One of the camps had 1,000 people show up. And we ran out of food, of course. One of the guys said to me, what do you think was the #1 item people wanted to see at open houses? I said, I don't have a clue. He goes, flush toilets. This is the 30s, remember. This guy said they would be lined up out the door. Everybody would have to come, stand there, flush it, watch it, and then they'd move on. And he said, that's what they wanted to do. But then as I was kind of, you know, being confused again, he said, well, you got to remember, we had guys that wouldn't turn the lights on because they were afraid they were going to get shot, you know. And we had people that had never had a shower, guys that had never had a shower. And he said, you know, you got to think of this stuff. Well, again, you can imagine what I hear when I tell kids this sort of stuff. But to me, that's getting those stories that we need to hear, sort of thing. So the first thing was they started these ball teams in order to interact with town. The second was they figured out these guys were functionally illiterate. One of the guys I talked to quit school in 2nd grade and went to work thinking he could help his family, you know. And so they started reading, writing, arithmetic, simple as that, and encouraged everybody to get involved. So that really got them through the first summer. This was only a 6-month plan in the beginning. Somebody thought the Depression was going to be over in 6 months. And so about August, oh, the Depression's not over, we're not done with our work, what are we gonna do? So Congress extended it 2 years, and that was what they would do, they would extend it 2 years. So, what are we gonna do with these guys for the winter, you know? By the end of that first summer, they had 12 camps going on, with 200 guys at each camp. What are we gonna do with them? So they built, at Boone, at Strawberry Point, and at Albia, they built wooden buildings. The rest of the guys went back to Fort Des Moines for the first winter. Well, the guys that were at the camps continued what they were doing. One of the guys that was at Backbone was telling me that one morning early, somebody from the Army came and got him up real early and said, put on your heavy clothes, you're going outdoors today. So they went out, and then he had to tell me they had dropped a tree earlier, and of course it got stuck in all the other trees. And they even brought a tractor in to try to get it out, and they couldn't get it out. So this coldest day of the winter, they took 200 guys out there, and the guys picked it up and carried it out. And this many years later, he was still bragging, proud of this, you know? So, and that's, we gotta remember, these CCC guys were just plain labor. They didn't have any equipment, you know? It was thought they could not run any equipment. Most of them had never had a job. You know, they would work it for farmers a day here and a day there. And so it was a shovel and a wheelbarrow is how they worked. And that's how they built these dams. So the guys at the camps were continue working. The guys that went to Fort Des Moines picked up nuts that first winter. Went out into the whatever forest they could find and picked up nuts. Because already they have plans for Iowa to have 3 forest nurseries with the CCC. And we did have them. Ames, Keosauqua in southwest Iowa, and up at Yellow River State Forest in northeast Iowa. All had forest nurseries. And, you know, they would start these trees from nuts because they're going to plant them. And a lot of this was with the soil erosion. When they built something, they would put black walnut trees in there to hold them, you know. And the farmers also had to agree they would not run cattle on it for 5 years, or they would have to pay the cost, that sort of thing. And so they know they're going to plant a lot of trees in the future. One of the guys said to me, how do you think we planted trees? And I went, with a shovel, you know? He goes, we stood in a straight line at arm's length apart. And he said, in my line there were 40 of us. And he said, the first tree went right here. We took 2 steps. There's the second tree. Got to keep our line straight. He said, we did that for 8 hours a day, day after day after day. They estimate 30 million trees were planted in Iowa. Yeah, 30 million trees. They estimate 3 billion were planted nationwide. And most of these came from these nuts that were started to trees. But again, to think that somebody's thought this through already. This is all in the works, you know. So that first winter, that's what they're working on. Come spring, we're up to 16 camps here in Iowa, and they're just going to it, you know. And one of the guys I talked to that I really got to talk to a lot, he had finished his junior year in high school, and his dad died. He was the oldest in the family. He had to go to work. He couldn't find a job, you know. So he went into the CCC, and he had made a deal that he could go to high school, and he would work nights and weekends in the mess kitchen. And he did finish high school that way. So I said to him one day, what did you do after you got done working at night? Did you play ball? No. Did you take more classes? No. So what did you do? He said, laundry. Oh, I hadn't thought about laundry. And he goes, so I said, okay, so you did laundry. He goes, at Backbone in 1934, they had 1 washing machine for 200 guys. And of course, it's an old ringer type. They don't have a dryer. And because of the Army, they can only hang out 2 hours a day on certain days. So he says it could literally take all week to get your laundry done, and then you start over. Well, that was great because there was another question for me to ask guys. Well, not too many days later, again, I get a phone call. The lady was from Eldora, Pine Lake. And she starts out the conversation saying, my mom and dad met through laundry. Okay, you got my attention. Well, first she told me her dad had worked on the dam at Pine Lake. And she said, until I was big enough to know better, I thought he built it all by himself because it was his dam. And they inspected it every summer. And I heard that over and over from the guys. Whatever they worked on, they checked on, that sort of thing. So, she says, the Steamboat Rock ladies near Eldora figured out a way they could make money. For 50 cents a month, they would come to camp, get the laundry, take it home, wash it, dry it, probably iron it, and their teenage daughters took it back to camp. What an ulterior motive here, huh? And so her mom and dad met through laundry. Well, then I ran into a 107-year-old guy, and he was very hard of hearing, and his wife was there, so it was really interesting. So, at one point I finally said to him, how'd you do laundry? And he mumbled something. Now, I couldn't catch what it was, and I wasn't sure I wanted to continue to push. Well, his wife did. She went, what did you say? He said, I said we took showers. Well, I'm still sitting there confused, but she got him to talk. He was at Shenandoah in southwest Iowa, and he said for 200 guys, they had one war sport, and they used the bathroom sink. And he said, we figured out we could take a shower with our clothes on, and then we'd rinse them and hang them out, Well, I had a 5-year-old grandson at the time. I was telling this to the family, and he goes, why didn't they just go outdoors and stand in the rain? Well, a few weeks ago when we had a rainy season again, I kept waiting for my daughter to call and say, thanks, Mom. So maybe he's forgotten it. Anyway, so that's how they managed it. Then by the late 30s, I'm seeing down in southeast Iowa, they're advertising in the newspapers for contract laundry services. So see how that changed camp to camp and year by year? And I always want to say, how did they know to change this stuff? How did they know to figure stuff out? The other thing I see this with is education. Like I said in the beginning, it was reading, writing, arithmetic. That was it. And, if you wanted to go to high school, they would work with you, that sort of thing. By the mid-30s, the guys are telling me it's technical, auto mechanics, electricity, welding, that sort of thing, careers. By the late 30s, it's changed again. It's gunsmithing, it's radar, it's radio repair, preparing for war. How did people know to do this? And who decided this? I know I won't get the answer, but that's the stuff I think about. Like I said, they finally began building permanent buildings, and these are just, I got something on it. These are just different camps. They very much look like Army camps, of course. The names of the camps are on the back if you're interested. And, they very much put up the camps. Now, like here at Melford, they had the camp, then it closed. They didn't take the buildings down. They left them, and then it came back again. So it's just interesting how everything just fell together or worked together, that sort of thing. After about 35, they actually put up prefab buildings, come in with a wall and the roof, and they claimed they could put a camp together in a weekend and take it apart in a weekend. And each camp's about 15 to 18 buildings. They got the barracks, they got the officers' quarters, they got the mess hall, they got the service area for the trucks and all this sort of thing. They got a rec hall, the mess kitchen, education building. I mean, you know, it's a town unto itself. Each camp had a hospital and a doctor. And that's another area where they were able to get in with the town, because a lot of these little towns didn't have hospitals. A lady down in southeast Iowa came to me and she said, I'm the only baby born at a CCC camp. Well, I tried to look it up and find that. I couldn't find anything on it. I'm sure it's what she was told, you know, that sort of thing. But her mom was having problems. The CCC camp was close. That's where they went, you know. And it was just another way of good feelings between the town and the camp. So, things are moving along. It's kind of interesting to me how, say, northeast Iowa was having floods. They might move everybody down to southwest Iowa, or a lot of them to southwest Iowa to work. And these were side camps. Spencer actually had a side camp. They would live in tents for maybe a whole summer, maybe only 6 or 8 weeks, something like that. And it was just a short-term project they would work on. And a lot of times these were the county parks and the city parks, that sort of thing. Or they might have just one thing they needed to do, and they'd bring them over that sort of way. So again, I'm just kind of, how do they keep track where these guys were, that sort of thing. Well, Mrs. Roosevelt went to FDR one day and said, there are families that don't have any boys. All they have is girls, and they're starving. We got to do something for them. He issued an executive order starting the she camps. Not CCC, she. Isn't that almost too cute? We didn't have any here. They would give our women a bus ticket and send them to the East Coast. They were mostly on the East Coast. And to me, the interesting thing is, a lot of the Indian women out of South Dakota were able to get out there. 8,500 women went through it in 4 years. 8,500 families were helped. The interesting thing is, the women were paid exactly the same as the guys. $30 a month, 25 of it goes right home to their families. They don't see it, because I asked the guys that. And they said, the guys told me they were paid 5 silver dollars. And they said the night before payday was poker night. And they claimed some people had some nice pots go home to their family. Okay, so the women are paid exactly the same. They have uniforms. They live away from home. The CCC and the she were the only one of the federal New Deal programs where they lived away from home. And you think about 17 to 23-year-old kids, most of these had never lived away from home. Maybe hadn't spent a night away from home. And that's one of the things the guys talked about, was how homesick they were. And there were actually guys that did quit and go home because they couldn't live with it, you know. The women were treated exactly the same. They learned gardening, preserving and canning, first aid, nursing, secretarial, typing, and planting trees. You know, wow. Well, the interesting thing is, for whatever reason, Congress never liked this program. And so they sent an inspector out to check on it. The inspector reported back, the women are on vacation with our tax dollars. And Congress closed it. Yeah. There were a couple other things that came up over the time frame that they did some adjustments with. In the very first law, it says there'll be no segregation, treated equal, all this stuff. Well, it's the 30s, and it didn't work that way. And so they tried putting the blacks on separate work projects. They tried putting them in separate barracks, and there were still problems. So they actually started Negro camps. Now, we didn't have any in Iowa, and then I kind of have to always back up and say, Lake Park had one for a short period of time. And no one there seems to know anything about it. I keep thinking, and I've watched the newspaper and stuff, thinking something's going to turn up, but I haven't found anything yet. Keosauqua down in southeast Iowa had 5 camps going at one time. So you think of 200 guys in each camp, that's 1,000 guys. Keosauqua was a little town. They had so much going on, they were going to apply for another camp. And they did apply for it. The word got around that somehow it was going to be a black camp. And the letters to the editor in the paper are truly unreal. Well, I said to my publisher, I said, we can't print the letters. And she said, oh, I can't believe that, send them to me. I sent them to her, she goes, we can't print the letters. Well, Keosauqua did not get their camp, and within 6 months they lost another one. I don't know how tied together those are or not, but. So our black men were sent to either Illinois or Minnesota to go to camp. And then of course there were the Indians, and they did start Indian camps also, and we did have one at Tama. And again, it was mostly they worked on the reservation. Did a lot of soil erosion, they fenced the reservation, built a building, planted a pine forest. And again, helped themselves, sort of thing. So everything's moving along, and you can tell by the late 30s they know war's coming. And they actually begin drafting guys out of the CCC camps. The parents sent the guy to the CCC camp, and the next letter they get, he's in the Army, that sort of thing. So of course Pearl Harbor changed everything. And the CCC closed July 1st, 1942. That was the end of it. And they were able to finish every project except Lake Geode down in southwest Iowa. And that did not get finished till after the war. So again, just unreal. They actually worked in 84 camps, or 84 parks in Iowa. And that's state, county, city, that sort of thing. So one of the things that I find interesting is, again, from the very beginning, these buildings were not to be destroyed. They were going to be reused. And especially with the prefab, they very much planned on reusing them. The Bancroft camp up here and the Belle Plaine camp were both soil erosion camps. And they were both prefab buildings. They took them apart, put them on a train, and they went up on the Alaskan Highway. So the guys that built the Alaskan Highway were living in camps from Iowa. A lot of our buildings went over to SAC at Omaha. Some colleges ended up, Decorah did, Mount Pleasant did, Fairfield did, would get a building or two, that sort of thing. The ones that stayed on the fairgrounds pretty much stayed at the fairgrounds. Thus far, I have only found one building standing, and it's at Eldora. And the Eldora camp's got a real interesting history. It was on the Hardin County Fairgrounds, so it was a CCC camp. When the CCC closed, it became an NYA camp, and that's National Youth Administration. And that was for 14 to 18-year-old kids, boys and girls, to learn a trade. So they came there and lived and learned a trade. I'd never heard of that program either. Then, after that, it became a POW camp. And they had Italian prisoners of war there, and they worked in the hemp fields and the hemp factories around that area. Then when that closed, it became home to returning servicemen and their families. 2 families would live in a barracks. And I talked with a woman that had lived there, and she just thought it was great. It was a great way to grow up. Then when that closed, most of the buildings went to the fairgrounds. This one building was set near the football fields, the Eldora football fields. So it was for the football team. And all these years, the football team had used it. About 15 years ago, a woman and her daughter realized, we need to preserve this, it's going to be gone. And so they formed a nonprofit, and it is now a CCC POW museum. And if you're looking for something to do, it's worth the trip. They've done a wonderful job. There is another museum over at Backbone at Strawberry Point, But unfortunately, they don't have anybody to oversee it, so it doesn't have any kind of hours, and you can't get it opened, and nobody knows what they have. So, you know, those are the main things. I'm gonna pause, see if you have questions. I know I've dumped a lot of information on you, and I may have confused you, because it's some, otherwise then I'll tell you a little bit about this area. Anything? Yeah.
Did you say there was a camp at Melford?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, when I was a kid, my family used to do some business in Melford when we were on a farm, and this would be in the 40s and early 50s.
Mm-hmm.
And there were some standard jokes about these workers, you know, it's like these light bulb jokes. How many people does it take to put in the light bulb?
I think
Depending
that
which
was the
group
WPA.
You're making fun of, you know?
I think it was the WPA.
It could be.
Yeah.
That, did they have a camp there? What is the difference, by the way?
Okay, the CCC was for 17 to 23-year-old guys. Again, couldn't be married, you know, all this sort of stuff. The CCC lived away from home, and they didn't have any sort of equipment, that sort of thing. The WPA was older men. Most of them had been veterans. They were married. They lived at home and worked just on projects of their own. And I do know that the WPA used the CCC buildings in Melford.
Did the WPA come at the same time that the CCC did?
It-
Or was it after, or?
It was just a couple years after the CCC.
Okay.
The CCC was the very first of the New Deal programs. The others all were after it, and then the WPA lasted longer, because most of the WPA guys weren't gonna be drafted. The CCC guys were gonna be drafted, and that's why it closed, because they were all going to the military.
So did they go through this, like the second, like 42 then? I mean, did the WPA?
In the book tells
oh,
how, I don't have it off the top
that-
of my
that's
head.
okay.
Yeah.
I'm just curious.
How long did the she last then?
4 years,
4 years.
yeah, and 8,500 women went through it, but, you know.
Was there some kind of changes in Congress, or I mean, how?
Who knows, you know, whether it was just this guy's reporting and that didn't, you know. And you will find that some people will say there was nothing for the women. Well, I've dug deep and there was, you know. And unfortunately, the CCC doesn't get the publicity the CCC did.
I never even knew it existed.
Well, most people didn't. I didn't either. And, you know, it didn't get the publicity, it was short-lived, they didn't build these permanent buildings, you know, that sort of thing. But again, look how it helped the families, you know, yeah.
How did you find survivors from this period? They gotta be quite a ways along in years.
They're in their 90s and 100s. And it's all just word of mouth. I put stuff in the newspaper, I tell the librarians, you know, I tell people when I speak, and it's somebody telling somebody and I get a phone call. If you had somebody in the CCC, you can still get their discharge papers. And these discharge papers are wonderful because they have information you won't get anywhere. It costs $75 to get it, but, you know, if it's your family, it's information. Anyway, I told a woman about this. She got her uncle's papers, and he had died while he was still in the CCC. And they did an autopsy, and all this comes in her paperwork. She's got 8 pages of stuff. Well, of course, she was very excited and all of this sort of stuff. So a lot of it just depends what the guy did, you know, and this is just a very simple one that somebody let me copy, you know.
Did they, one of these groups, either the WPA or the CCC, build a lakeside lab building up at
CCC did.
Bogie? And now what about Fort Defiance State Park at Esterville?
That was CCC also.
They have
Oh, yeah.
a pretty substantial building up there. I helped one of my brothers do some work up there a few years ago. And that's a very impressive building.
Right.
It looks like it's gonna be there another 100 years.
Well, and you know, that's the thing, when you think about they had no equipment to build this stuff, you know. And
And
how,
I think they use
and-
more lumber per square foot then than they do now, and
Well-
it's really sturdy looking lumber, I'll tell you that.
well, and they, you know, they cut down trees and they used them. They picked up rocks and they used them, that sort of thing. Think when they built Pilot Mound up here. Pilot Knob. They built that.
How about Gull Point State Park?
They
Those
built all
buildings,
that.
Yeah,
Mhm.
they're
Yeah.
really substantial buildings.
Right. And again, with no equipment.
Yeah,
You know, when I'm talking to kids and I say, when they built the dam, this was a shovel and a wheelbarrow, you know.
I'll tell you, if you spend much time on a construction crew though, you realize how innovative and creative the mind is because they can work around the problems.
Right, right. Well, and they did have foremen that had the knowledge.
Yeah,
They had stonemasons and this sort of stuff that, you know, would have the knowledge and would teach the guys. Well, and you know, Beads Lake down at Hampton is the only one like it in the US. And supposedly there's not a bit of cement in the dam. That they worked the rocks, and all the rocks were picked up from the soil around. And at Hampton, they actually advertised in the newspaper, do you need rocks picked up? The CCC guys will do it, you know. So think how many rocks they picked up for us.
huh.
So, anything else?
And maybe this is the part that you're about to get to, but did you say there was something in Clay County? That
Yeah.
was-
Mm-hmm. So, I will. Anything else? Okay. In the northwest area, I have found 14 camps. They were at Cherokee, Denison, Missouri Valley, Mofield. This is, should say northwest. No, it should say southwest. Sorry about that. They built Gull Point from Melford and Stone State Park at Sioux City. They had side camps at Lake Park, which worked on Silver Lake, Peterson, Ruthven, and Spencer. At Spencer, in the beginning, was a camp at the fairgrounds, and it was a tent camp. It was just a side camp. They arrived June 1st, 1933. And they worked in the forestry within 50 miles of Spencer. And then they moved to winter quarters at Melford. And there they worked building soil erosion dams. Then the camp came back here, a second camp came here, and again lived in tents on the Clay County Fairgrounds. And their first project was to work on the Clay County Fairgrounds. And again, they worked in a 50-mile radius. They worked at Peterson State Park, Rush Lake. They built trails and steps and fireplaces at Rush Lake, Medium Lake, clearing and riprapping the shoreline, Hortons Point, Goppas Point, and Emmitsburg State Park. And they constructed steps near the Crescent Beach Hotel on West Lake. They dredged the canal entrance. At Silver Lake, they worked building a new park, building a road, a vehicle bridge, and riprapping. And again, the guys went back to Melford for the winter. Then Ruthven was a side camp, and there they worked at Lost Island Lake. And they had sleeping sickness come to camp. And the camp was supposed to close, and they didn't because they had this exposure going on that they didn't want to take to somebody else. In '36, they took boys from the Melford CCC camp to the Clay County Fair. And it required 5 trucks to transport the guys. And it's kind of interesting. Each of these, they really, one of the guys said to me, he said, you know, the officers were there to make us better. And I said, okay, you kind of got to explain yourself. He goes, well, when we're eating, you know, if we're spread out all over the table or got our elbows on the table or something, he said they would come up to us and tap us on the shoulder and say, take your elbows off the table, you know, use your napkin. He said it wasn't stuff we were taught at home. And they were trying to make us better, that sort of thing. Down around Des Moines, they took the guys to the state fair. Again, so few of them had seen this stuff, and they really were working, trying to help them be better people, that sort of thing. They worked at Mud Lake, which is supposed to be east of here. I can't find much on that. Does anybody know anything? It's maybe called Dry Mud Lake Wildlife Management Area now. And they planted trees is what they did. They planted 2,200 pines, 3,800 chokecherry, blackberry, and wild plum trees, and 1,500 black locust trees in that area. And then they worked at Wanata State Park at Peterson, and it's they did a shelter and a dam, and used the stone again. So that's just touching upon what went on in this area, because like we said, Gull Point and all these others, and I'm very much in awe of everything they did because of how it was done. And as far as I know, every state park except Ledges State Park at Boone is on the National Register of Historic Places. So these buildings will not be destroyed, which is important. And when any repairs have to be made, they have to go along and do it similar and that sort of thing. The ranger at Ledges is trying to get somebody to do this, and his friends group has no interest in it. And he just can't understand why they can't see the need for it, So, but this was in every state of the Union, including Alaska and Hawaii, which weren't states yet, plus the Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. So every state had this going on. Now, where did the money come from? And that's one thing that I really spent a lot of time on because I couldn't figure out where they got the money for this. Well, first I did find some information, bookkeeping, and I called my daughter, who's a CPA, and said, would you look at this for me because I can't understand it? She goes, no. So she didn't. This costs the state money also. I can see in the state budget where the money is budgeted every year. And a lot of the money for the state was to buy state parkland. They bought a lot of the state parkland up around here and in other places. When they wanted to do a park, they had to get the land, of course. And so that's where a lot of the state park money came from, or state money came for. And it's in the budget that they budgeted CCC. The federal government, we got to back up to 1919, a year before Prohibition starts. 93% of the federal budget comes from distilleries, breweries, and taverns. Taxes on liquor. 1920, Prohibition begins. We lose 93% of the federal budget. Gosh, why did we have a depression? Okay, the depression ends, or the Prohibition ends in 1933. So we begin receiving taxes again. Plus, they increased the tax on what they called luxury items. And luxury items were liquor, tobacco, automobiles, and chewing gum. Yeah, I don't understand that one either. But the taxes came back and increased 30%. And that's what paid for the New Deal programs. So, and again, it's billions of dollars that were spent, So, anything else?
Well spent.
When is your book on Northwest Iowa coming out?
It'll be next fall at the earliest, and it might not be that soon. I'm working.
Yeah,
So-
so we can find out about this through the Iowan?
Well, the Iowan is no longer my publisher, and I'm not sure that they'll tell you anything.
Oh,
Probably Robin's your best source.
okay.
And I actually went with, my publisher went off and started her own company. And I went with her, and of course right now I'm waiting on a book, and I'm beginning to wonder if I made a good choice. But I'm trying to be patient. I'm not good at patience.
Is that German POW camp in Algona, is that in one of these buildings that used to be CCC or not?
No, not at all. Can I take a few minutes?
Yeah.
The Algona and Clarinda POW camps were built specially for POWs. And they spent close to $1 million on each camp. In 1930 dollars, 1940 dollars, yeah. So those two camps were built. Then all these side camps, branch camps, were very much in temporary things. Now the Shenandoah POW camp was in a CCC camp. The Eldora CCC camp also had POWs. So some did use the CCC camps. At Waverly, they used the YWCA camp, you know. Some camps were in the Scene Court Company buildings. So it's really, and some were just in tents. So it kind of just depended what they had available when they could get them. Nationwide, we had about 425,000 POWs in the U.S. Iowa had about 25,000, German, Italian, and Japanese. We're the only state other than Wisconsin that had Japanese. And Clarinda had Japanese. Now, overall, especially here, I know around Waverly, I know down in southwest Iowa, southeast Iowa, the prisoners were very accepted and welcomed because we had so many German ancestors. And a lot of the people could still speak German, that sort of thing. And plus, they knew they needed these guys to do this work, you know. Their sons were off to war. We needed these guys to do the work. I really think there would have been people starving if we wouldn't have had the POWs, that sort of thing. Down at Clarinda, the Germans and Italians were accepted completely, no problems. When the Japanese came, farmers supposedly went to the camp and said, I don't want Japanese working on my property. And they really had a tough time finding stuff for them to do. They figured out they could work at nurseries. And I guess they were very good workers with the nurseries. And of course they have so many down in that area. So, but yeah, overall, the prisoners were very accepted. Of course there were, you know, if the son was in the POW camp in Germany and some of this, yeah. Some prisoners of war came back and actually served as guards at Algona. And one of the guys went to the company commander and said, don't let me have any contact with the prisoners. I can't handle it. And so he didn't, you know. We pretty much operated on the golden rule. Everything had to be done by the Geneva Convention. And it's funny what was spelled out in this Geneva Convention. But the POWs had to eat as good as their guards did. And that was a real problem with the farmers and the guards and some of this. But I mean, this is spelled out in the Geneva Convention. They have to be fed the same amount of calories as the guards got. You know, if the guards lived in heated buildings, the prisoners had to be in heated buildings. And so we operated with the thought that hopefully the POWs would tell their families how well they were treated, and that might help our prisoners of war. It didn't, but, you know. It's kind of interesting to me to see how many of these POWs from Germany brought their families to see where they were at. And they wanted them to meet the farmers. They wanted them to see where they lived, that sort of thing. And I just heard just a few weeks ago, down at Eldora, which was a POW camp, they've just found out that during the 60s, one of the POWs had said to his family, if we ever have to run, if we ever have to be separated, go to Eldora, Iowa. That was their go-to place. I mean, you know, wow. So we should be very proud how we treated them, and they are very pleased with how we were treated. Now, the one thing that always comes up, or I'm expecting to come up, is no POWs stayed. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but Waverly, there was always somebody that stayed. I got a call from Clorinda. The guy says, you've got to talk to so-and-so. He's a POW that stayed. Well, I had a person I was working on in that area, and I said, okay, who's this, whatever. He goes, he was a POW in Germany. And everybody keeps saying he was a German POW, you know. But out of the 425,000, there were some that died. But out of the 425,000, 20 were not returned because they had managed to get out. And they got out to disappear. You know, they didn't want to go home, they disappeared. And even until the late 70s, they were coming forward because they couldn't live the way they were having to live, you know. That they came forward and admitted they were POWs that had escaped and stuff. So only about 3,000 came back to the US and became citizens. Because once they got home, they had to get on the list and work their way over, you know. They could get a sponsor, but the sponsor had to agree to make sure all their needs were met and could maybe have to spend $5,000, which again is a lot of money, you know. So out of that, only 3,000 actually came and became citizens. So that kind of hits the high points anyway. So anything else? Well, thank you for coming. You're welcome to look at books. They're $20 each and you get a signature today, and thank you.
Thank you.